Hello and welcome. My name's Ethan Bennett and I'm the owner and counselor of Abba Healing Services. So I wanted to share with you my personal story about why it is that I do what I do. To tell you about myself, I have to go back to the beginning, and probably like many of you, I came out of a broken home. My parents divorced when I was 3.5, and when I was 4, I never saw or spoke to my dad again after that. And at the beginning of that, I didn't realize that there was anything wrong. My mom was very caring and loving, and she wanted to make sure and worked very hard to make sure that my sister and I never had to worry about feeling like we missed out on anything. So early on, I didn't notice too much about there being anything missing. But as I began to get older, especially as I started to get into middle school and high school, as I'm navigating how to be a man and how to relate to women, how to date, all those different things that we don't think about and we kind of take for granted, I started to notice that something was missing. And it wasn't that I was thinking about it. I didn't connect the dots. I just felt it. And I started to get into some bad habits with pornography and sex addiction, those sorts of things. But I still didn't know exactly what was going on or what the problem was. So I eventually went to college, and again, more of the same sort of thing. And I had an existential crisis of sorts where I realized I wasn't going down the path that I wanted to be going down. And I thought back to a time when I was in high school, and I felt like God was asking me to think about whether or not He was calling me to be a priest or to be married and have children. And so I went to seminary, and I was in seminary for 2 years. And within that first year, my prayer was very dry. I kept asking God, what do you want me to do? I went in there excited, thinking like God was just going to reveal everything to me very quickly and that I was going to know immediately. But that's not how it worked. And my prayer was dry, and we would have holy hours daily. And each time I would go to pray, I received nothing. Maybe you've heard of Mother Teresa and how she experienced that sort of dark night of the soul where she did not feel the presence of God for years and years during her ministry. And I only received a small taste of that for roughly a year. And it felt like torture, just begging God to give me an answer, but He wouldn't share that with me. But I now know, looking back on it, that was a time of purification for me and a time of growth for me, that I had to allow myself to be healed in certain ways before I could get that answer. And so in my second year of seminary, I'm on an 8-day silent retreat, and we're reflecting on the Trinity. And we spend a holy hour with each person of the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And I'm praying with God the Father, and I'm looking up at Him. This is the first time I had ever imagined this. It was like I was a 2 or 3-year-old child sitting in the lap of the Father, looking up at Him, and Him gazing back at me, just loving me, adoring me. And I had stopped asking God what He wanted me to do at that point, because I had just kind of given up hope that I was going to get an answer. So he asked me, Ethan, ask me what I want you to do. And so I did. I asked God, what is it that you want me to do? And His answer surprised me. He said, what do you want to do? And I was totally caught off guard, because up to this point I had just assumed that God, whatever I wanted didn't matter, and that it only mattered what God wanted. So I was afraid to give Him an answer. I thought, well, if I tell him what I want, he's just going to hit me with a spiritual 2x4 and tell me, no, you idiot, that's not what I want for you. You need to be doing this. Because I knew that whatever God wanted for me was better than anything I could dream for myself. Well, so because he had asked me, what do I want to do? I knew I had to respond to him, and I finally built up the courage to say to him. So I kind of squinted up and said, God, I want to be a husband and father. And some time passed, a few seconds of silence. And then I felt this, what felt like rain coming across my body from the top of my head down to my toes, and the sense of peace. And I had a conviction, and I knew that this is what God was calling me to do, to be a husband and father. You see, it hadn't dawned on me that maybe my desires had been purified, and maybe my desires were what God wanted for me. And that he desired for me to be happy. So I did leave seminary, and I started dating my now wife, got married, had children, but I still had doubts about myself, and that how am I supposed to be a husband and father when I didn't have a good example of that growing up. I had plenty of uncles and priests in my life who were good father figures. Of course, they were flawed in their own ways, but I didn't have a presence in my home of a good father. And I went to a spiritual director who's like a priest or a pastor who helps you figure out where God's calling you in that moment and to help guide your prayer. And he asked me to read The Return of the Prodigal Son by Henry Nouwen. And as I started to read that and pray through it, I began to see that I wasn't only the prodigal son. I mean, that part was easy for me to see. But I was also the elder son who at times resents people who leave home, who leave the church, who leave what God's calling them to do. But I was also being called by God to become the father. And to be the father not only to my children and the husband to my wife, but he was beginning to stir something in me that I hadn't been aware of before. And so as I was talking about these issues with my spiritual director, he said to me, Ethan, it seems like all of these issues are stemming from this wound that you have with your father, with your earthly father. And I said, yeah, Father, I know that. I know that a lot of my issues go back to my dad, and I've worked through some of those, but it just can't seem to go away. And he said to me, well, Ethan, have you ever thought about going to visit your dad? I said, well, of course, Father, I've thought about visiting my dad. So when I was 18 years old, my granddaddy told me, Ethan, if you ever want to visit your dad, just let me know and I'll get you connected with him. My granddaddy is my dad's dad. And at the time, I wasn't ready for it. So about a year later, I came back to him and I said, I was thinking about it, and maybe I do want to connect with my dad. And my granddaddy told me, Ethan, I'm sorry, but I talked to your dad about it, and it seems like maybe this just isn't a good time. He seems to be in a little bit of denial about you and your sister. And so I had just sort of resigned myself to the fact that maybe I would never get to meet my dad. And my granddaddy had even gone so far as to change his funeral plans so that we never had to meet, because he did not want to cause any kind of problem between us. Well, years go by, and here I am in front of this priest, and he's telling me that maybe I should go visit my dad. So I tell him that story, and he says, so what? What do you mean, Father? I mean, so what? Who cares if he didn't want to meet with you? It sounds like that's what you need to do, so maybe you reach out to him. And I thought, well, yeah, I guess you're right. Maybe I do just need to go ahead and do it anyway. So I took off a week from work, went back home to my hometown and visited with family that I hadn't seen for a while. Went to my granddaddy, and when I told him, he was shocked. He didn't know what to think. But as he started to realize why I was doing this, he started to get excited. And at this point, his health had been declining, so he hadn't been the same as he had been in years past. But I saw more energy in him now than I had seen in him for years. And he was excited about connecting me with my dad. So I went to this diner in the middle of a work week, and I walk in the door, and I'm probably the youngest person there by about 30 years. So my dad stands up to greet me, and he sticks out his hand. Well, before going into the diner, I prayed over the story of the return of the prodigal son, and I knew that I was being called to be the father to my dad. And so when I had prepared myself, or when I saw him, yes, he had caused me a lot of sacrifice and suffering and pain, but none of that really mattered at that moment, and that I was being called to embrace him, just as the father did when he waited for his son on the edge of town, welcomed him home and threw a party for him. And so when my dad stuck out his hand, I pushed it out of the way and threw my arms around him and hugged him. And we hugged for probably 2 minutes. It felt like an eternity. And when we finally sat down, the waitress came by and she said, "How long has it been since you all have seen each other?" And we told her 24 years. She said, "Wow, thank you for allowing me to see that." And so my father and I had a conversation, and we got to reconnect, and we still try to stay in touch with one another. It's not perfect. We're still trying to figure out how to be father and son after years of not having any contact with each other. We're still learning how to relate to each other after wounds and distance. But we're striving towards that reunification. And God, I believe, wants the same for all of you. He wants to reunite you and to heal you. And He wants to bring you into His heart so that you can experience love, a deep love that is purifying, healing, and transforming. And so that you can ultimately be consoled by Him, so that your love begins to overflow and spill onto those who are around you, your wife, your husband, your kids, your friends and family. Everyone that you come in contact with will experience the love that flows from you, that flows from the heart of the Father. So I hope that you enjoyed this story and that it connected with you in some way. I look forward to seeing you around here. God bless.